As I see it, there are two key problems facing Linux and open source in general in 2020. Over the next year, we've got two big problems we've got to face. Now, of course, there's other issues and smaller issues and different things going on, but there's two big ones that I think are going to come to a head in 2020 in a very, very big way. And I wrote an article around this. If you want to read the article, the full text, go on over to patreon.com/Brian Lunduke. Is that the URL? I never know what. Yeah, that's the URL. Patreon.com/Brian Lunduke. It's free. You can just read it there. It's just on Patreon. I kind of use that as my blog, at least at the moment. Go read it if you want, or I'm going to read it to you right now if you don't feel like reading it. But I've got some additional things to say along the way, so some color commentary, if you will. So let's just dive into this, because this is going to get me yelled at most likely, but it's silly that this would get me yelled at, but it's going to get me yelled at. So let's dive in here. The world of free and open source software, Linux et al., I love the phrase et al., that just needs to be used more often, has some serious problems that are going to reach a critical point in the year ahead. Those problems are not technological. As of right now, Linux and open source more generally powers every single one of the top 500 supercomputers in the world. The majority of all smartphones have primarily Linux and open source at their core. No, from a tech point of view, open source is doing just dandy. I might say that that's an understatement. Open source and Linux in general is rocking from the tech point of view, and from the adoption point of view, just crushing it. No. Instead, the problems as I see them come in two forms. And then here's the point where I start to get myself into trouble. More for the second point than the first point, but let's dive in, shall we? Number one. Influence and control over open source institutions by organizations and companies who are, in most areas of their business, opposed to open source. Some of the largest and arguably most influential organizations within the open source world are heavily funded by companies who are predominantly opposed to open source as a concept. Microsoft and Facebook fund the Open Source Initiative. A lot of people don't realize that. The OSI, the Open Source Initiative, they're funded, at least in part, by Microsoft and Facebook. Facebook, VMware, Microsoft, Comcast, and Oracle, and so many others. All companies that focus on closed source almost entirely. The vast majority of their work is closed, and some of these firms take drastic legal action against open source projects and their users, all fund the Linux Foundation and have seats on the Linux Foundation board. Those are all companies with seats that have been purchased for the Linux Foundation board. And many people are raising like red flags. They're saying, hey, Lunduke, Microsoft and Facebook and VMware, they release source code. Comcast releases source code. And you're right. They do release source code. But so much of what they produce is closed that when you look at the total percentage of their work that they make as open source or contributing to open source, it is essentially, statistically, 0%. It does not hit the point where it hits above like 0.5% of what they produce has open source to it. Most of it, 99.9 into infinity for the most part, is closed source. So these are closed source companies, right? I don't think there's any real contest about that. I like that some of them do some open source, and that's good, and that should be high-fived. But they are closed source companies, and that's not a vilification. That is just simply a reasonable understanding of what their business model is. I continue. Some of these seats on the Linux Foundation Board of Directors cost $500,000 per year. That's a real thing. That's a real thing. Companies don't throw around that kind of money without expecting something in return. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just good, obvious business. If Microsoft, for example, simply wished to be generous, they would donate the $500,000, issue a press release about how nice they are, and be hands off. That's what you'd do if you were just trying to be philanthropic or just trying to get good press out of it. Instead, they are paying for board positions to give them greater control over activities and stances of organizations like the Linux Foundation. If you want to be philanthropic, you donate. If you want control, you donate in exchange for something, which is called purchasing. When you get something in return for your donation, it's not just a donation, you're making a purchase, right? So that means Microsoft is purchasing people's seats on the board of the Linux Foundation, which means that gives them control. That's just simply how that works. Again, not a conspiracy. I'm not claiming anything unfounded or unproven here. Simply pointing out the business relationships that have formed and that companies don't typically pay $500,000 per year for nothing in return. I want to also stress this point. None of this makes these companies like Microsoft evil. I want to make this very, very clear. I don't view Microsoft as evil. I know many people do. I don't view any company necessarily as evil. Simply a company focused primarily on closed source software and with a track record of attacking those that threaten their core business. This is something they've sued so many companies related to open source things and patents that got used in open source things and fat over here and all sorts of stuff, right? They're just doing the business they do. Looking at how the business needs, real or perceived, of such a company can impact the organizations they have some control over, such as the Open Source Initiative or the Linux Foundation, is, regardless of your views of any of these entities, the prudent thing to do. To me, Microsoft buying seats on the Linux Foundation board feels like a cigarette company buying a seat on the board of an organization focused on helping people quit smoking, in that their interests are not, by and large, aligned. Or Tesla buying a seat on the board of a chain of gas stations, right? It's just simply doesn't make sense unless they're seeking to influence their rival, right? Because Microsoft is not an open source company. Microsoft has a very tiny fraction of their people working on something related to getting open source out. We're talking, again, statistically 0%. It's real. It's a real thing. And if you look at the size of Microsoft is so huge that even that 0.04% or whatever it is ends up being a lot of code because they're huge. That's how it works, right? It's like, I don't know. Let's say Toyota. Toyota decides to release bicycles. Well, let's say they sell 1,000 bicycles. Toyota make tons of cars and trucks across the land, but they sold 1,000 bicycles. Well, 1,000 bikes is a lot of bicycles, right? Are they a bicycle company or are they a car company? They're still a car company. Just because they sold a bunch of bikes doesn't make them a car company. Anyway, I digress. Note, I have reached out to both the Linux Foundation and Microsoft repeatedly over the last several months. I genuinely want their viewpoint on this. Genuinely. I really, really do. To date, no response has been given of any kind. In fact, I have been told, at least from the Microsoft side of things, that people are told to not talk to me. That's a real thing. If corporate control over a small number of open source organizations was the extent of the issue, I'd say this is a somewhat isolated business case. Isolated case, this is not. One of the other big activities is of companies focused on closed source and restricting rights of end users, such as right to repair and fair use of content, purchasing significant control over standards bodies that help drive the direction of the broader computer industry. One of the easiest examples to explain is that of Microsoft, Google, and Netflix purchasing power within the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, that is the self-appointed organization responsible for setting the standards that drive not just everything you see via your web browser, but many ways that computing devices communicate behind the scenes. This power has had direct ramifications, most notably, at least to me, the fact that those companies pushed the W3C to adopt a policy of support of injecting closed source into web standards and pushing DRM, digital rights management, which restricts where, when, and how you can, for example, watch a video, as a ratified standard of the open web. It's ridiculous. In this, we have a clear, well-documented example of large closed-source companies causing significant change, making closed source and DRM a standard within something that is by design supposed to remain fully open and DRM-free. Regardless of if you believe those are good, positive changes, I don't, but I can see the arguments for them. There's no denying that the changes are significant, and the purchasing power of large corporations made them happen. Those companies appear to remain committed to paying large sums of money to maintain similar control over these standards bodies and open source organizations going forward. As such, it is reasonable to assume additional standards and policies will be pushed that positively impact their bottom line. Again, because that's how business works. Will those policies be ultimately good or bad for open source and open standards? That remains to be seen. Thus far, the track record is mixed at best. We have had some bad results, such as exactly what I point out there with moving things on the web to a less open and more closed web. But maybe things will be positive in the future. The reality is, these companies, and this is not part of the article, this is just a sidetrack, but the reality is these companies, I don't think Microsoft is out to hurt Linux, right? I don't have any thought that Microsoft's like, oh, we got to kill and crush open source. No, they want to make money. They're a business. They're a publicly traded company. They have a responsibility to their shareholders to produce money. And so whatever it is that's going to produce that money, that's what they're going to do. There's no doubt about that. That's how business works. Oh, but the thing is, Microsoft, just like so many other closed source companies that are doing the thing where they're investing into open source projects and standards bodies, have a vested interest in closed source. They are closed source companies. So they're investing in their competitor to control their competitor. Their motives may be wonderful and happy, but I doubt it. The second item here, I'm going to get yelled at so much. The second item here I want to bring up as a big problem that we're facing in 2020, and in my opinion, the bigger problem, though the two are related, and I'll point that out in a moment, is as follows. Influence and control of open source projects, institutions, and communities by those seeking to harm others. Yeah, and this is a very different thing than the first item. I'm going to read this here. I'm a pretty live and let live sort of guy. If people have good intentions to treat each other with respect and love, I tend to like them. I've even gone so far as to publish my own personal code of conduct. It reads, in entirety, be excellent to each other. Unfortunately, not everyone within the broader open source world follows that ideal. Over the course of 2019 and 2018 before it, we've seen a steady increase in, for lack of a better word, hate. A small portion of the open source world that actively acts in hateful, exclusionary ways towards other members of the open source community. Based on what I've observed, I believe this sort of thing will continue to ratchet up during 2020 until a breaking point is reached. Let me give two examples that I think illustrate my point. Both relate to technology conferences in the open source world. And I'm choosing this very specifically here, because when we're talking about conferences, you're talking about things where there's lots of people involved, right? You're bringing together, when you have a conference, a festival, you are almost by definition, bringing people together from all walks of life, from all different locales, and oftentimes in different professions even, to talk around a similar theme or topic. And so I really feel like the examples here should be driven around that. So that's why I chose these examples. There are umpteenth examples of issues relating to different individual open source projects and companies and mailing lists and everything else. But I wanted to focus on the conferences. I feel like they're the best examples. A year and a half ago, at a prominent open source conference held in Portland, Oregon, I'm talking, yeah, you guys can figure this one out. A keynote was given by a highly visible Microsoft employee. During that keynote, the presenter specifically encouraged those in attendance to commit crimes against people based on skin color and gender, in this case, white and male, though the idea is horrific regardless of gender and ethnicity. He said we needed people to be, and I quote, willing to go to jail, that we need accomplices. He said, and I quote, hold on, let me back that up. He said, and this isn't necessarily part of the article, we don't need allies, we need accomplices. He even had a slide. And this is part of the article. He even had a slide talking about the need for accomplices against people of certain skin colors. How horrible is that? Why do people treat people that way? Gosh. This was not a rinky-dink conference. This, hey, look, I had a little error there. I'm just going to correct my error. Look at that. This, THIS. That's how you spell this. Haha, professional writer. This was not a nobody from a no-name company. This was a high-profile person from Microsoft, giving a conference-sanctioned keynote presentation. And in it, he was seeking to divide the entire community, to encourage racism and sexism to the point of committing criminal activity against each other. This was not an isolated incident. These sorts of hateful calls to commit crime against other members of the open source community are becoming increasingly commonplace at conferences across the land. I know the across the land is a flamboyant statement for me to make here, but it's true. It's happening all over the place. People are being mean to each other. In another example, just last month, the Linux Foundation banned one podcaster from attending a conference. I said attending the conference. I mean a conference. There we go. Immediately after. This is great. I should always do shows where I read my articles because I'll actually proofread them and catch them. I'm used to having an editor, and I don't have one right now. It's very rough. Let me back up. In another example, just last month, the Linux Foundation banned one podcaster from attending a conference immediately after someone complained that said podcaster once wore a red Make America Great Again hat. Note, that particular situation is slightly more complex and warrants further study if you are interested in that topic, but that does appear to have been the core of why the individual was banned. Hold with me on this. I reached out to the Linux Foundation repeatedly via multiple channels for clarification. I offered them a chance, so many chances, to say something to the effect of, we do not ban members of the Republican Party, or something similar. Or, we don't ban people simply because they voted for someone we don't like for president. Whatever they wanted to say to clarify it, I was open to. I even gave them examples of things they could say that would just make it clear, that make not a problem. If the individual's political affiliation had no bearing on the banning, making a statement to that effect would have been a simple, obvious way to calm any tension, and this was a very tense situation. They declined, meaning the Linux Foundation declined to make any such statement or any statement at all to me or any other journalist who contacted them. I know of many journalists who contacted them. No statement, no comment, no response, no see our earlier comment on blah, 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 nothing. It's frustrating because, and this is off script, I covered that particular issue in much more depth. There's a link to it in this article to the other article. Feel free to go read it. And in that article, I link to other articles other people have written about the topic that go into even more depth than I went into. I encourage you, read them all if you want to, if you're interested in the situation. Don't simply take my word for everything. Go dive into it if you want to. It's okay. But in this situation, the order of events here really are: someone complained that person A wore a red MAGA hat, right? And these complaint happened online on Twitter. The Linux Foundation almost instantly banned that person and gave no real viable reason for it. In fact, the reason they gave to the person when they banned this person was that the person violated basically their code of conduct. But the reason that they gave was called tone policing, which isn't listed anywhere in their code of conduct. So they literally made it up just to ban this person. It seems like they're banning people because of political affiliation. There are a few similarities with these two cases. Similarities shared. I back up for a second. I want to think good about people, you know? I want to assume good intentions until I know for a fact that someone has bad intentions, right? Like if someone says something that I find offensive, I like to at least try to think, well, maybe they didn't mean it to be offensive, right? Maybe they weren't meaning to just be a meanie pants, right? Maybe they just come from a different culture, come from a different group that speaks in a different way than I do, and I'm misunderstanding what they're trying to say. I like to try to assume that, you know, because we're all different. We all come from different walks of life. Heck, just within the country I live in America. And I live up in the northwest corner of America. And I'll tell you what, different parts of this country are very different culturally. And just because I'm from one part doesn't mean that someone from another part means me harm. We just might speak a slightly different language, use a little different lingo. So I like to assume good intentions. But when something like this happens, that the Linux Foundation was getting an increasingly massive amount of flack for, they could have fixed it instantly by saying, no. People wearing red MAGA hats, they're totally welcome at our events. And we're not even talking about wearing the hats that are literally just support for a presidential candidate at the event. We're talking about a picture of a person who wore the hat like a couple years prior, can't go to an event now because one time they took a picture where they had a hat that was red on. And what do you do about all the people who work at Red Hat wearing hats? I digress. There are a few similarities with these two cases. Similarities shared with numerous other such instances over the last 2 years. But at the core, both actions, one from the Linux Foundation and one from a representative of Microsoft, seek to harm someone else who supposedly is deemed unacceptable. In one case, someone is banned from participating in a portion of the industry, going to an industry event, due to a perceived political affiliation, one shared by roughly half of the U.S. population. And in the other, a direct call to action to commit crimes against others based on race and gender. That's it. Those are intents to harm someone. Those aren't keeping someone else safe. Those are intents to specifically harm someone. This is happening all the time. Like with the concerns over closed source companies buying influence over open source organizations, these are not isolated incidents, and they appear to be ramping up. A truly fascinating detail of all this is that many of the individuals and organizations who are preaching hate, and there's plenty, or seeking to cause division and harm, work directly with the companies buying control of open source organizations. In fact, if you draw a Venn diagram with one circle representing people seeking to harm others who they disagree with, And the other circle being companies buying influence of open source. It's pretty much just a single circle with perhaps a small little divot at the top. That may seem a bit over the top, but it's true. I've made a point here of leaving names out. I mean, I called out a couple of big company names, but I've left all the individual names out of this. And the reason for that is thus. I don't want people to attack others. I don't want people to harm others. I disagree with many of the individuals who have been preaching hate. I disagree very strongly. But I don't want to hurt those people. I just want there to be less hate. So I left out names. I know many people will point to it and be like, you have no proof. Be like, well, all this is pretty easy to dig up. I've left enough information in here, and enough links heading off other places, and enough words, or a quick little DuckDuckGo or Google or Bing search, whatever, is going to find you all the names you want. But I don't want anyone to start going around yelling at each other. So I've left the names out. That was my intention here. Misguided, perhaps, but my intention is that we treat each other well. So I have left the names out. That said, that Venn diagram's still basically a circle, and it's ridiculous. That could be a coincidence. Now, I'm not the kind of guy that sees one Venn diagram and is like, aha, proof. No. That means there's a correlation, but not necessarily a causation, blah, 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 blah. But the correlation is distinct. So what comes next? If I had to make a prediction for 2020 based on the increasing activities over the last couple of years, I would say that things will only accelerate and intensify with both of the issues I call out here. It's difficult to say exactly how everything will shake out in the end, but major divisions among the open source world seem nearly inevitable. Forking of major critical projects, we've seen some of that, not a ton, but some. Communities dividing in half, we've seen a little bit of that too. Journalists being banned from events for covering them accurately. You're going to see that in 2020. Guaranteed. Continued threats against people who speak out against hate and criticism. So, just to be clear here, I did an article around the Linux Foundation banning of the person who wore the MAGA hat. The article I did was extremely factual. Nobody was able to point to a lie I included or a misstatement or something that wasn't factual. I take great pride in trying to be very, very factual about things. I have my opinions, but facts are important. Just the same. And my opinions in that case were basically like, I don't like racism. Which, by the way, if you guys were wondering where the racism was in that particular piece, go read the article. The people that were yelling at the person in the MAGA hat were also preaching like hateful stuff against other people of different skin colors. Like, it was intense. And I basically said flat out, I don't like racism. So I got attacked for that viciously. People screaming on the internet with the most profane tirades, every dirty word you can think of. George Carlin would have been proud at their massive dirty word vocabulary. Just screaming. Did they make misstatements and untruths? Oh yeah, tons. I'd say hundreds. No joke. But more importantly, they were just mean. And they attacked. And I expect to get similarly attacked for this. People who hate attack people who say, hey, I don't like hate. That's what happens. Again, not naming names. I'm just saying, please don't hate people so much. I digress. As it stands right now, I know that me making the statements I make in this piece will cause me to receive numerous threats. I expect hit pieces. Just how it goes. And that sounds just awful. But the statements I've made are accurate, factual, honest, and I stand by them. Again, it sounds awful. People are going to yell at me. I know that. Maybe I'll just stay off of all social media. Maybe I'll just go off the internet for a week. And it's funny that I will get attacked for saying, hey, let's be nice to each other. Let's not preach hate. Let's not be racist. I'm going to get attacked for that by many people who claim to be fighting against racism. But I say, hey, let's not be racist. And they're like, oh, get him. It makes no sense at all. In fact, let's see. Where was I at? And okay, they're accurate, factual, honest, and I stand by them. In fact, that is likely the only way to truly combat the issues facing the open source world over the next year. If we all, as a group, stand up and speak out calmly, kindly, but honestly and factually. The more of us speak out against hate, the harder it will be to vilify concepts like kindness and being excellent to each other. I mean, how you can vilify those sorts of statements, I don't know. So here I am, making this stand right now, this ridiculous stand, this stand that shouldn't need to be taken. It's so ridiculous that this needs to be a stand that it makes me feel kind of dumb for just taking it. I might as well be taking a stand saying, I like air, or water makes me less thirsty. Like, it's just so obvious. But here I am, making this stand. First, I do not think that companies with a vested interest in the failure of open source should be allowed to fund the major open source organizations. That is, to say the least, a conflict of interest. Perhaps saying that people with a vested interest in the failure of open source is an overstatement. Perhaps it is. I'm not sure. Certainly, companies with a vested interest in the success of the competitor to open source, in the success of closed source, they should not be funding and controlling the open source organizations. That'd be sort of like the major shareholder of Pepsi being the CEO of Coke. It's just not a good idea for at least one of the groups. It's a conflict of interest, and I don't think it's a good idea, and it's not going to lead anywhere great. There might be some good outcomes, but ultimately the outcomes should be bad there. We'll find out. But it's happening either way. I mean, either way, we're knee-deep in it now, so we'll find out. And the second item is that I roundly reject the hate, racism, sexism, and overall bigotry that is working to divide the open source world even further. I do not care what country you come from, what religion you are, or what your political party is, or any other aspect of you, what your hair color is, or what your gender is. I don't care about any of that. If you're a good person, you're a good person. If you treat others with kindness, you're A-okay with me. That's how I stand. End of story. My personal beliefs, your personal beliefs, those people's personal beliefs, don't enter into it. If you are nice, I like you. End of story. Both of those comments will get me attacked, which is ridiculous. Bullies be damned. I'm going to get attacked for this. It's ridiculous. Anyway, this is my stance, such that it is, on the internet. I've got an article, some videos, and some podcasts. Share them. Pass them around to people. See if people agree with them. I don't see how a person could possibly disagree, at least with that second stance. The second stance of let's basically not be jerks to each other. I don't see how someone can reject that. It's physically impossible, seeming to me. But people have been. Violently. And the first one, it just makes sense to me. Now, we can certainly have an argument about whether or not it makes sense for large closed source companies like, let's say, Comcast, Microsoft, etc., to invest so heavily into open source foundations that they have voting control and total control over policies, structure, etc. About whether that's a good idea or not. Is it? I don't think so. I think it's a really bad idea. Again, Tesla, Elon Musk should not be buying controlling shares of gas stations across the country, right? Because he makes cars that don't use gas. I don't know. It doesn't, right? Elon Musk should not be buying controlling shares of, I don't know, things that compete with a Tesla. You know what I'm saying here. Coke and Pepsi, you don't combine the two. Yes, we can have those arguments. Personally, I think it's a flawed thing that's happening right now. I understand why the Linux Foundation would accept, at this point, the millions of dollars from closed source companies. I get that. Millions of dollars are nice. I'm sure I have a price as well. If closed source companies, if Microsoft comes up to me and says, Landuk, here is millions of dollars. Here's a giant sack of cash. All you got to do is let us be on the board of the content you create for the Landuk show. Am I going to accept the cash? Millions, man. Maybe. I'm not the strongest man in the world. Maybe I would. Probably. Heck, probably. Would it have an impact on the type of content I create? You bet it would. Almost assuredly. Because they're not donating. They're buying influence. That's how it works. All right. I'm going to move on now. If you want to read this, go on over to lunduk.com. There's on the left-hand side, there's a little spot where it says written articles. You can read over on Patreon. Again, it's all free. If you want to donate over on Patreon, you'll get, in exchange for that, you get like little email notifications and whatnot. Totally not required. If you want to just listen to it on iTunes or Spotify or whatever, or the MP3 RSS feed, there's links all right there. If you're going to watch this show, I recommend doing it on lbry. Lbry is the best. Decentralized. No one can censor me. It's fantastic. And in fact, I am the third largest channel on lbry, lbry. Go to lbry.com, download it. It's fantastic. They got a nice Android client, Linux and Windows and blah, 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 blah clients. It's fantastic. Plus, when you watch the show, it comes down as a DRM-free MP4 file, which means you can just back it up. It's glorious. It's like YouTube. If YouTube weren't evil and had more, okay, YouTube's not necessarily evil, just not great. But if YouTube allowed you more control over your content, and if YouTube didn't censor, and if YouTube didn't hide things with their algorithm where they just don't like people saying certain things. By the way, YouTube hit a lot of my videos with Linux in the title. Yeah. We studied that for a while. It was about a year and a half, 2 years ago. We were looking into it and like, whoa, if I put the word Linux in the title, YouTube wouldn't suggest the video as often. But if I took Linux out of the title, whoop, my videos went way up. It was very weird. Huh? What are you doing there, YouTube? And of course, there's a couple of companies that help make this show possible. Pogo Linux, who make literally the best rigs on planet Earth. I got one of them behind me here. Look at that right there. Here's the back of it. Oh, I love this machine. That's my Tempest. It's whisper quiet, nice little i9 in there. It's just a glorious rig. And of course, it's pogolinux.com, so you get Linux on everything. And if you want to put Windows on some of their servers or workstations, I think they do all that for you too. I don't know. I don't order Windows on any hardware, but if you want it, maybe you can ask them real nicely. Otherwise, I'll put Linux on it. And Linode, who have some of the best cloud services that are on planet Earth. They just opened a data center in Sydney, Australia. I can't remember if it's the 11th data center they have or 12th, something like that. It's a lot of data centers. Linode is getting big and they're everywhere. So if you want servers in different parts of the globe to kind of keep things fast for people in different regions, you can. It's awesome. Plus, if you go to linode.com/Lunduk, you get $20 credit. Sign up that way. Click on little bloop to deploy my Linux server. Set up a Nextcloud server. Set up a WordPress blog. Set up just a little SSH box that you can SSH into and play with while you're at work. Why not? Go to linode.com/Lunduk. It's glorious. All right. Whew. I am now going to go put on my asbestos suit, turn off all the internets, and hope that I don't get yelled at so hard that we just kind of break and tear a hole in the fabric of reality. Be nice to everybody, guys. Seriously, just be really nice to everybody, please. I love you guys. I'll see you later.